While the last few people are coming in, just a brief announcement. Somebody pointed out to me that some of you might not understand that the video talk thing on genetics is actually required listening or watching. It's not just something extra. So if you haven't done that, how many of you have tried to look at that already? I want to ask you, those of you who not, be sure and do it soon because we're going to move on to a new topic today. I have to wait a few more minutes. Okay, I guess that's good enough. So we're just finishing up last time talking about nature-nurture, and I'd given you this example of the milk-yielding cows. I have a new toy here. It's a mouse that hopefully I can... oh, come on. Oh, that's wrong. Sorry. Oh, come on. I pressed the wrong button on it. Sorry. There we go. All right. I have a mouse that has this little laser thingy on it. It's going to take me a while to get the manual dexterity to learn how to use it. But the advantage is it will show up on the Camtasia recording. In any case, we talked about the morals of the story here, the end of the hour, and that basically pretty much finished the lectures, but I want to go on and give you a couple of take-home messages. In the slides that you have, what is that? Oh, hold on a minute, guys. No. Okay. Try that again. In the slides that you have, which I don't have on this computer now, so I can't show them to you. In the slides you have a detailed summary called Where Have We Been? And you may find that useful to read over. And last year I used that, I presented that, but I decided I didn't like it. So, I mean, it's fine, but it wasn't quite what I wanted. Sorry, folks. Go away. All right. I decided it wasn't quite what I wanted to do, and so I wrote something different, which let's see if it's that. And that's what I do want to summarize with for these nature-nurture lectures. So let's look at these take-home messages. First of all, we talked about the general biology of development and the relationship of genes to that. And what we learned was that all genes have multiple effects, and the development of virtually all traits depend upon many genes. This is what we call the pleiotropic, what people call the pleiotropic effect. It's very important. And there's not a gene for an intelligence or a gene for any other complex trait. Any of those traits involve many, many genes, and every time you change a gene, mutate a gene or whatever, have a different allele, you don't just change one trait, you typically change many, many traits, although some may be more conspicuous than others. Secondly, gene readout in development is totally controlled by cellular environment, which is itself determined by the previous history of gene readout. So we had this picture of a circle with genes to environment, to cellular environment, back to the genes, and so on. It's sort of a continual development is a continual vicious circle of interactions between the genes and the cellular environment. But in the case of the neural development, something special happens in that the cellular environment of the developing cells is determined in part by events on the outside, which can then influence the development of the circuitry of the brain, the circuitry of the nervous system. The circuitry of the nervous system, the development, the growth, formation of the nervous system can in part be influenced by events occurring outside. First outside the mother, in the case of humans, where the mother's carrying the infant. And then, since development is far from complete at the time of birth, the events happening to the infant, him or herself. Those things can influence the actual formation of circuitry in the nervous system. Second point, main point, is that we then started talking about the origin, genetic versus environmental, of various individual differences between people. And what we learned was that individual differences are often due to genetic differences to a surprising extent. Even things like religiosity, what vocation somebody goes after, and things like that, seem to have, in part, a genetic basis. Differences between individuals have a genetic basis. And so that's actually pretty much of a surprise, and at some level it makes you think, well, everything's genetic. And that's true, and that maybe that's true, or quite a bit of that's true in a sense. However, this does not necessarily mean that these things which are determined genetically, or these differences which are the result of genetic differences, are beyond our control. Because it may be that if we discover exactly how a given trait develops, we may be able, not necessarily so, but we may be able to find ways to change the phenotype that a particular genotype produces. So that's good news. It may require a lot of research, and it may not be possible in some cases, but in other cases it may be possible. So even if you have genes that are terrible for this, that, or the other thing, you yourself, it may be, well, probably it's too late for you, but if your kids are going to have the same genes, it may be that there are things that can be done about it. Science may discover those. And then, I mean, that's true in two senses. One, there may be ways of getting around the problems, but there may also be ways of preventing the problems from developing in the first place. And then finally, that's all good, but what one has to recall is that attempts to control the phenotype, and for that matter, attempts to do genetic manipulations, if one dares to do such a thing, must be done with great care, because the effects of genotype, the effects of an environmental manipulation intended to change genotype, first of all, may be different for different genotypes. So you've got to know the genotype probably in order to do this in an intelligent way. And secondly, when you're targeting one trait, others may be affected. That's what we learned from the cow example. So these are the broad take-home messages from this last week of lecture. Now, I would like to be able to tell you that if you know those things, that you're going to do well on the exam. But that's not true. You need to not only know these things, you have to know exactly why, based upon the lectures, why I'm saying each of them. In other words, you have to know not only the bottom lines. Come on. You need to know not only the bottom lines, but the details that they are based on. The observations, the experiments, and so on and so forth. You pretty much have to know everything that I've lectured about. Or sorry, let me put it differently. Everything that I've lectured about is fair game. And the better you know it, the better you're going to do. So it's not just the bottom line that you have to know. And that's going to be true not only for this first week of material, but for the whole rest of my lectures. Okay, that is the end of the nature-nurture topic, and I want to now change gears entirely and begin the next topic, which we're scheduled to have 2 lectures on. We'll probably go a little bit beyond that, because I think I didn't make quite enough time for it. This is a picture of Charles Darwin, who is the father, kind of the theory of evolution. He certainly didn't invent the theory, but he's the person that convinced most people that it was true. And also the theory of natural selection. And we'll talk about that as we go on here. That's in these lectures. Now, Darwin was trying to answer some of the big questions of life. Things like sorry. Oh, I see. I got the little receiver on the computer doesn't like it when I'm so far away. I'm sorry. I just wonder if I need to forgive my playing with my toys. Yeah, sort of thing. That's interesting. Darwin was trying to answer 4 kinds of big questions. One is, where did we and other life forms come from? Secondly, why are we here? Thirdly, you know what? Actually, let me ask you a question. I'll come back to that in a minute. For those of you who are watching these Camtasia things at home, how many of you have been doing that? Do you care whether there's a pointer? Does it matter very much? No. Okay, well, let me use the real laser pointer in here if I can find it. I don't like that. Not my day for laser pointers. Okay, yeah. All right. Anyway, first, where did we other life forms come from? Why are we here? Why are we the way we are? And why are there so many different forms of life on Earth? These are really, these are big questions. And these were the kinds of things that Darwin was interested in. Now, so the lectures that we're going to give on Darwin are going to be organized like this. First of all, we're going to talk about Darwin's main ideas. And then I'll come back to that in just a moment. And then, after we've done that, we're going to talk about some application of the theory of natural selection to some interesting psychological questions. But let's go back here to this first block of material, which is what we're going to be doing today, starting today. Darwin didn't really just have one idea. He had 3 ideas, which are essentially separable. They're 3 separate things. The first of these was the theory of evolution. This was the idea that all the various kinds of animals on Earth, including man, descended from one or a few kinds of primordial animals. So we're all the different kinds of animals are biologically related to one another, and that one form gradually changed into others over long periods of geological time. That's an idea that other people had, but until Darwin came along, it was not nearly so widely, it wasn't widely accepted. And after Darwin, it was very widely accepted. Secondly, Darwin put forward a theory to explain why evolution happened. Evolution could be true, the theory could be totally wrong. But the theory he put forward, he called the theory, and people have called the theory of natural selection, and we will talk about that in a little while. And then finally, even if evolution occurs, according to whatever basis, because of natural selection or for some other reason, even if evolution occurs, if you just think about evolution, that just might mean that a given kind of animal will gradually change over time and eventually become a different kind of animal. But that's not what's actually happened. What's actually happened is we have a whole bunch of different kinds of animals existing all at the same time. So why is it that one had this breakup into different species of animals? Why doesn't one just have one kind of animal which gradually evolves? Why do you have a bunch of different kinds of animals? And so that's the question of why there is speciation. And each of these questions of does evolution occur, why does it occur, and what causes speciation, each of these is a separate question, which has its own separate things that have to be discussed about it. And so those are the things we're going to be discussing today and for first part of next time. Now, at the time that Darwin started his work, the general belief about the origin of the different forms of life on Earth, the different kinds of animals in particular, plants as well, on Earth, was that each was put in place by God for the particular situation in which it was found, the particular ecological niche in which it occurred. And the idea was that each species of animal was put in that place and was made by God particularly for that place, and so it would be very well suited for that place. This is the idea of independent or special creation. For every different kind of animal, God put that kind of animal on Earth to live in the kind of place that that animal or plant lived. However, Darwin, and this was, of course, basically a theological idea, and this was very widely, this is what most people believed at the time. Certainly not all, but many. Darwin was something of a college dropout. His father wanted him to study something in school he didn't want to study, and eventually he kind of, I think he was supposed to be either a theologian or a doctor. Actually, I can't quite remember what it was supposed to be, but it was certainly not a biologist. But he fell in with some various naturalists and geologists, and a tour on the HMS Beagle, a boat, was about to begin, a 2-year research expedition sailing around the world, and they needed a naturalist. And Darwin had become quite an accomplished naturalist, and they offered him the job, and he took it, much to his father's displeasure. So he spent 2 years voyaging around the world on the HMS Beagle. And he made many observations that made him decide that the theory of special creation just couldn't explain the things that he was seeing. The most famous of these observations were those made in looking at the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. So the Galapagos Islands here, coast of South America is here, several hundred miles distance, 400 kilometers is the scale here. These were volcanic islands. At some time in the past, there have been volcanoes there, and probably any life there might have been on them was totally destroyed, would have been destroyed. So the presumption would be that any life there was here was either, was put here, I guess, at a later time by God. I guess that's what the theologians would have said. But what Darwin noticed was of the various forms of life bore an amazing similarity to the animals of the mainland. They weren't the same species. They were different species. All biologists agreed, and other biologists had studied these animals, and everybody agreed that the animals, and plants for that matter, but we're focusing on the animals here were different species than those in the mainland, and yet there were tremendous similarities. Yet, because these were volcanic islands, and this was an entirely different ecology, the conditions of life here and here, on the islands and on the mainland, were totally different. And so he basically asked the question, if God made these animals for life specifically here, and other animals for life specifically here, and the conditions of life, the ecology and so on, are so different, why are the animals so similar? An obvious answer occurred to him is that what in fact had happened is that the animals that lived here after the volcanoes had gone extinct had come from the mainland. They'd gotten there by some sort of case of birds, some may have flown, there may have been rafts. There's one theory that there may have been a land bridge at some time between here and there. But one way or another, the animals from the occasional hurricanes blew animals, goodness knows what. But somehow, the animals from here got to here and then underwent gradual change so that they were no longer the same species as over here, but they were, in fact, biologically related to the animals over here. So that was his idea. And this is, so he viewed this as evidence for evolution. Now, here's a picture of one group of animals that he studied especially closely, which have become known as Darwin's finches. There are some 20-odd different species of finches, I believe, on that. I forget how many there are, or something like that, on the islands. And these are Darwin's finches. And they're specialized for eating different kinds of things. So this guy eats leaves, this guy eats fruit, this guy eats seeds. You notice their beaks. This guy gets gnats. Their beaks are different from one another to make it possible for them to get the kinds of food that they eat on the island. The presumption was that somehow, but these are all finches. Biologists agree that they were different species, but they're all finches and they all bore a similarity to finches of the mainland. So his idea was that the similarity was probably because they probably all evolved from animals that had come over from the mainland. Now let me read to you a little bit from The Origin of the Species, written a long time ago, but it's still perfectly intelligible. Partly I think it's interesting to see that these old books are still quite meaningful and interesting, and one can understand them. It makes sense. And partly this is such an important book that I think it's worth actually having a look at it. I'm not going to read you the whole book, but a little bit. So he says, this is from The Origin of the Species, then. The most striking, and talking about the Galapagos Islands, the most striking and important fact for us in regard to the inhabitants of islands is their affinity to those of the nearest mainland, without there actually being the same species. Numerous instances could be given of this fact. I will give only one, that of the Galapagos archipelago, situated under the equator between 500 and 600 miles from the shores of South America. Here, almost every product of the land and water bears the unmistakable stamp of the American continent, the South American continent. There are 26 species of land birds, 25 kinds of land birds, and 26 kinds of land birds, and 25 of these are ranked by Mr. Gould, the famous biologist, as distinct species, supposed to have been created here. That's the theory of special creation that people normally assume. Yet, the close affinity of most of these birds to American species in every character, in their habits, gestures, and tones of voice, was manifest, i.e. obvious. So it is with the other animals and with nearly all the plants, as shown by Dr. Hooker in his admirable memoir of the flora of this archipelago. The naturalist, looking at the inhabitants of these volcanic islands in the Pacific, distant several hundred miles from the continent, yet feels that he is standing on American, South American land. Why should this be so? Why should the species, which are supposed to have been created in the Galapagos archipelago and nowhere else, again the idea of special creation, bear so plain a stamp of affinity to those created in America? There is nothing in the conditions of life, in the geological nature of the islands, in their height or climate, or in the proportions in which these several classes are associated together, which resembles closely the conditions of South American coast. In fact, there is considerable dissimilarity in all these respects. I believe these facts can receive no sort of explanation on the ordinary view of independent or special creation. Whereas, on the view here maintained, it is obvious that the Galapagos Islands would be likely to receive colonists, whether by occasional means of transport or by formerly continuous land, from America, and that such colonists would be liable to modification, the principle of inheritance still betraying their original birthplace. All right. Now, when he wrote The Origin of Species, he was very careful to stay away from any discussion of humans, of man. Because whereas he thought that people might be willing to accept this idea of evolution for other kinds of animals, there were an awful lot of people who would object to it, to the argument that man evolved from something, from a mere animal, a non-human animal. And indeed, there were lots of complaints, even based upon the Origin of Species, which didn't discuss man very much. Here are a couple of kinds of things that were said. Man has special privileges and responsibilities. Only he has a soul. Somebody else said, if Darwin were correct, man would have no more right to life after death than a gnat or an ant, and so on. Lots of complaints of this sort. Darwin didn't plan to remain quiet about man. He just didn't want to put it in the Origin of Species. So he wrote a separate book a bit later, after the Origin of Species had been published, to address the man question, the human question specifically, and this is called The Descent of Man. And let's read a little bit from it too, because there's some very interesting things in there. He makes 4 arguments as to why man, evidence that man evolved from lower animals. Some of the arguments, I'm going to read you for historical reasons, are not very convincing, partly because he didn't know a lot of things then that he didn't know. But some are very telling. This first one is a good argument. It is notorious that man is constructed on the same general type or model as other mammals. All the bones in a skeleton can be compared with corresponding bones in a monkey, a bat, or a seal. So it is with its muscles, nerves, blood vessels, and internal viscera. The brain, the most important of all the organs, follows the same law as shown by Huxley and other anatomists. And every chief fissure and fold in the brain of man, and we'll see these fissures and folds later on when we talk about the cerebral cortex, has its analogy in that of the orangutan, of the orang. So that is true, and that's a telling argument. Then he talks about physiology, and this one's not so good these days. Man is liable to receive from the lower animals and to communicate to them certain diseases such as hydrophobia, variola, the glanders, syphilis, cholera, herpes, and so on. Some of these I know what they are. Some of them are old names that I don't know what they are, but it doesn't really matter. The idea was that if an animal was physiologically, if one kind of animal was physiologically very different from another kind of animal, then the two kinds of animals shouldn't be able to get diseases from one another. Whether that's right or not right in modern medicine, I'm not quite sure, but it's probably a little suspect. But he uses the argument that there can be transfer of diseases from us to monkeys and from monkeys to us as evidence that we are closely related. And he goes on to say, these things that we can transfer these diseases, in fact, proves a close similarity of their tissues and blood, both in minute structure and composition, far more plainly than does their comparison under the best microscope or by aid of the best chemical analysis. Monkeys are liable to many of the same non-contagious diseases. Well, I think they are contagious diseases, sort of by definition, as we are. Thus, Regner, who carefully observed for a long time the cebus in his native land, found it liable to catarrh, I think that's flu, or colds, I forget which, with the usual symptoms, and which, when often recurrent, led to consumption, as tuberculosis, so he had that a little wrong. That's not accurate, but like he thought it was. At the time, everybody thought this. These monkeys also suffered from apoplexy, inflammation of the bowels, and cataract of the eye. The younger ones, when shedding their milk teeth, often died of fever, as did young humans in those days. Medicines produce, this next one is a lot of fun. I don't really tell them. Medicines produce the same effect on them as on us. Many kinds of monkeys have a strong taste for tea, coffee, and spirituous liquors. They will also, as I have myself seen on this wonderful voyage around the world he took, smoke tobacco with pleasure. Brehm asserts that the natives of northeastern Africa catch the wild baboons by exposing vessels with strong beer, by which they are made drunk. He has seen some of these animals, which he kept in confinement in this state, and he gives a laughable account of their behavior and strange grimaces. On the following morning, they were very cross and dismal. They held their aching heads with both hands and wore a most pitiable expression. When beer or wine was offered them, they turned away with disgust, but relished the juice of lemon, the well-known morning after cure. An American monkey in Antilles, after getting drunk on brandy, would never touch it again, and thus was wiser than many men. These trifling facts prove how similar the nerves of taste must be, more than taste, in monkeys and man, and how similarly the whole nervous system is affected. Well, you know, that one has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, but there's something to it. Okay, sex. This one, at least this first part of this one, is also a little bit perhaps iffy. The whole process of that most important function, the reproduction of the species, is strikingly the same in all mammals, from the first act of courtship by the male to the birth and nurturing of the young. Man and women differ. Man differs from woman in size, bodily strength, hairiness, and so on, as well as in mind. He said it, I didn't either. In the same manner as do the two sexes of many mammals. Okay. So that now embryonic development. This one is tough. This one's very interesting and important. Man is developed from an ovule, that is to say, a fertilized egg, about 1/25 of an inch in diameter, which differs in no respect from the ovules of other animals or other mammals at any rate. The embryo itself, at a very early period, can hardly be distinguished from that of other members of the vertebrate kingdom. So he says all vertebrates, not just mammals. At this period, the arteries run in arch-like branches, as if to carry the blood to branchii of gills, which are not present in the higher vertebrate. In other words, there is a blood supply for the gills in the embryos of humans and dogs, even though obviously humans and dogs don't have gills at all during development. As if to carry blood to the branchii, which are not present in the higher vertebrata, though the slits on the side of the neck still remain in the embryo. And he points to them here in humans, and here in dogs, marking their former position. This is sometimes referred to as ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny, where you see in the development things that are thought to have been true during the course of evolution of the species. At a somewhat later period, when the extremities, the arms and the hands and feet, are developed, the feet of lizards and mammals, as the illustrious von Baer remarks, the wings and feet of birds, no less than the hands and feet of man, all arise from the same fundamental form. So if you look at what those come from in the embryo, they look identical. It is, says Professor Huxley, quite in the later stages of development that the young human being presents marked differences from the young ape. The bearing of these facts now given is unmistakable. The homological construction, let me give you a bit of a definition here. Homologous, homolog. When two structures, in biology, when two structures in one kind of animal versus another kind of animal are similar because of relatedness, biological relatedness, we say they are homologous. When they are similar for other reasons, because perhaps they have different functions and they evolve independently of one another, we refer to them as analogous. So that's his use of the word homological up here. The bearing of these facts now given is unmistakable. The homological construction of the whole frame in members of the same class, namely the vertebrates, is intelligible if we admit their descent from a common progenitor, together with their subsequent adaptation to diversified conditions. On any other view, the similarity of pattern between the hand of a man or monkey, the foot of a horse, the flipper of a seal, and the wing of a bat is utterly inexplicable. Thus, we can understand how it has come to pass that man and all other vertebrate animals have been constructed on the same general model. Why they pass through the same early stages of development, namely because they're all related to each other, and why they retain certain rudiments in common. Consequently, we ought to frankly admit their community of descent. To take any other view is to admit that our own structure and that of all the animals around us is a mere snare laid to entrap our judgment, by God, he means. This conclusion is greatly strengthened if we look to the members of the whole animal series, not just the vertebrates, but also lower animals, and consider the evidence derived from their affinities or classification, their geographical distribution, and geological succession over time. It is only our natural prejudice and that arrogance which made our forefathers declare that they were descended from demigods, which leads us to demur to this conclusion. But the time will before long come when it will be thought wonderful, by which he means amazing, that naturalists who were well acquainted with comparative structure and development of man and other mammals should have believed that each was the work of a separate act of creation. All right, okay. Now, so that is the theory of evolution and some of the evidence that led him to believe that it was true. The theory that he gave to explain why evolution occurs is a separate thing. This is the theory of natural selection. This slide that I've got in light blue is a former slide that you can look at, but I decided I liked explaining it a different way, and so here's the way that I want to explain it now. And you have both of these slides. So the theory of natural selection, the proposed cause of evolution. And this theory, I'm not going to give in Darwin's words because the exact way we think about this theory has changed quite a bit since Darwin. The basic ideas are his, are the same as his, but when Darwin wrote, he didn't understand genetics. Gregory Mendel, who gave us our first understanding of genetics, had already written stuff by the time Darwin wrote, but Darwin wasn't aware of it. And so he had some funny ideas about genetics, which in turn makes him have somewhat funny ideas about how he thought about this idea of what the basis for evolution was. So I'm going to give you something that comes closer to the modern theory, version of the theory, rather than Darwin's version. So basically, the whole theory is right up here in this box, which is this. The genetically determined traits, I should say those genetically determined traits, the individuals who have the greatest reproductive success will spread. I don't think I said that very well. If you have a genetically, what this says is if an animal has a genetically determined trait that increases its reproductive success, its ability to have lots of offspring, then that trait will spread to the next generation. That's kind of obvious. I mean, if the trait's genetically determined and the individuals who have it have more kids, or more offspring, then more individuals in the next generation are going to have it because it's a genetically determined trait, because they will inherit those genes. So that's very obvious. Now, this term reproductive success is important. Reproductive success is defined by biologists as having lots of offspring. That part is obvious. But there's an added crucial part, who themselves make it to reproductive age. So if you have the offspring and they don't live, that's not reproductive success from a biological point of view because it doesn't have any impact on evolution or on the next generation. So reproductive success specifically, this term is a biological term, which means having lots of offspring who do make it to reproductive age. Now, there are a whole variety of things that can contribute to reproductive success. And here's a list of some of them. Being good at caring for offspring. That will increase your reproductive success. For any specific number of offspring you have, if you take better care of them, they're more likely to live to reproductive age, and they themselves will therefore breed. So that increases your reproductive success, or an individual's reproductive success. Being good at attracting mates. If you're not good at attracting mates, you don't have any offspring at all. Being good at fighting off predators. If you don't fight off predators, you may get killed, or your offspring may get killed, and no descendants. Being good at escaping predators. Ditto. Being good at winning fights over scarce resources. Obviously, individuals who can win fights over scarce resources, especially in hard times, is going to themselves live and is going to be able to get food for their offspring if they're a species which does that. Being good at obtaining and digesting food. Good digestion is a good thing to have if you want to survive and pass the ability to survive on to your children, especially when food is scarce. Knowing when to run and when to fight. Having good sense. Knowing when to hide, etc., etc., etc. So, all kinds of things contribute to reproductive success. I emphasize this because popular accounts talk about one animal killing off another, and nature red and tooth and claw and all that kind of stuff. But it's about much more mundane things and more often crucial. Okay, now this theory up here is not only true, it's obviously true. Once you understand the meanings of the various words, this is a logical truth. It's not something that could be right or wrong. Once you know what these things mean, and given the facts of genetics, that has got to be true. Therefore, it's got to be true that natural selection occurs. And therefore, evolution by natural selection must occur. But if that's true, since this is necessarily true, why is it called a theory? Because a theory is something that might be true and might be false. Something that's not necessarily true, and yet this is necessarily true. And the reason that it's called a theory is that whereas it is true that natural selection absolutely has to occur, given what we know about genetics, and absolutely must cause some degree of evolution, would be expected to cause some degree of evolution, it is conceivable that there are other things that also influence the course of evolution. For example, it might be that life experiences might alter genetic composition. One can imagine that possibility. One might imagine that the divine creator might influence the process of evolution, and on and on and on. What makes the theory of evolution a theory is, what the theory of evolution says is not only, what the theory of natural selection says is not only that natural selection occurs and causes evolution, but that it is the only thing causing evolution. That's what the theory of natural selection says, and that could be wrong. For a long time, people thought that that was true, but that turned out to be wrong. Some people thought that was true, but that turned out to be wrong. Lots of people still think that that's true, and so on. So the theory of natural selection is a theory because it says that the only force driving the direction of evolution is selection for reproductive success. That is not self-evidently true, though there is overwhelming evidence that it is true. Okay, so we've talked about evolution. What are we doing? We've talked about evolution. We've talked about natural selection. We'll be talking more about natural selection. But what we've not yet talked about is speciation. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's look at the left side of the slide first. So suppose we have some species of animal, A, at some point in time. Typically what happens is a given species can only live in certain ecological circumstances, and those circumstances where a given species can live are not just uniformly spread over the earth. There'll be this place here, that place there, somewhere else separated from places separated from one another, which are provide adequate and satisfactory habitats for the characteristics of that particular species. So we typically have species in localized regions, here, here, here. If I think of this as a big map of the world or something like that. These regions where the animals live and interbreed is referred to as a deme. You don't even remember that word. That's where the word demography comes from. There are there will always be localized interbreeding populations of these animals separated from one another. Now, one would expect that under the theory of natural selection, that the animals in one of these regions would over long periods of time would gradually change as a result of those individuals who had more offspring, who had genetically characteristics that led them to have more offspring, would gradually change. So you have a gradual drift in the characteristics of the population over time. The drift in how many individuals carry particular genes, and therefore in what traits those individuals have. So there will be gradual change over time in each of these populations. Okay? Now, one theory for speciation that has been put forward is what I don't think you have to remember this word, is what's been called sympatric speciation. And the idea goes like this. Each of these locales in which these animals, species A, can live, will be a little bit different from others. This one might be hotter, this one might be colder, drier, wetter, whatever. Different kinds of food available, whatever. But there'll be differences, and so there'll be gradual changes in each population, which will be different for each population. So the animals living here will get one way. The animals here will, over time, become somewhat different. Will gradually get somewhat different characteristics, and ditto over here. Now, the theory of sympatric speciation, or the hypothesis of sympatric speciation, is that eventually the differences for the animals in these different populations get so great that either they cannot any longer breed, or when they come together, if they do come together to breed, they look at each other and say, not interested. So they don't breed. And once that happens, of course, these guys and these guys and these guys are reproductively isolated from one another. They can't breed, and so they can't mix anymore. And at that point, you have a necessarily distinct populations of animals that no longer can interact, can no longer mix genetically. That's what we mean by a species. A species is a group of animals which is genetically isolated from other groups of animals. And the theory of sympatric speciation is that this can happen in different genes of animals. However, it turns out that if these different regions are all even remotely connected to one another, so that animals can, in principle, get from here to here and back from one to another, it turns out that biologists think, I think pretty much all biologists think now, that there is a sufficient amount of gene flow between the different populations all along, such that they can never probably form different species according to the sympatric speciation idea, because there will always be a certain amount of mixing of genes which will prevent the diversification and therefore prevent things getting to a point where they either can't or won't mate with one another. So most biologists think that sympatric speciation can't happen. It's a good idea. There are rare circumstances, very special circumstances for certain kinds of animals, like certain kinds of insects that live on certain kinds of plants, that live on very specific plants, where maybe something like this does happen. But by and large, if it happens, it's very, very, very rare. In order to get speciation, you have to have the two different populations of animals get so different from one another that they can't or won't mate. And most biologists believe that the only way that can happen is if there is some sort of tremendously powerful enforced separation of the populations. That is to say, if there's some of them on one side of a mountain and the others on the other side of a range of mountains, or something so that there can't be hardly any cross-communication of genes. And so the general belief is that you need what's called geographical isolation, which I don't seem like to have. I don't have the term here, but I should. Where you have geographical isolation. The different populations are separated by some physical features of the environment that are so profound that they almost cannot exchange genes for very, very, very long periods of time. And it is thought that those are the circumstances that are required for speciation. But when that happens, when you do have such circumstances, you do often get speciation. That is to say, you get to a point where the animals can no longer mix genes. And when that happens, you have different species of animals. And that is Darwin's and other people's theory for why speciation occurs. Okay, I think that is a good time to stop.